Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine Ayers-Wickenhauser, Director of Communications at Direct Trust, and I'm so excited today to be joined by Therasa Bell, President and CTO of Know2. And Therasa is one of our most recent Interop heroes. Therasa, welcome, and will you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself and Know2?
You bet. Thank you, Catherine. My name is Therasa Bell. As you mentioned, I am the president and CTO of Know2. I'm a co-founder of the organization and have spent my whole entire career in healthcare IT. So you could probably feel bad for me after that, but I actually love it. I wake up every day energized about what I'm doing and love the interoperability space in particular, because I think it's where healthcare is, it needs to evolve and has a huge opportunity in front of it to evolve. And so every day I'm passionate about what we're doing and what the industry is doing and groups like Direct Trust. Know2 in particular, we're a very different company in healthcare. I think most people would say that, and hopefully in a very positive way. When we started the company, myself and the co-founder, 12 years ago now, we purposely went the opposite direction of everybody else. So that sounds weird. Let me explain. So 12 years ago, we looked at the healthcare industry and said, there's a couple problems that we see. One is the amount of noise that was starting to come out of just different standards, which I'll touch on here in a bit, that we saw in the industry. So we were going to solve that problem and make it easy for providers, solution vendors, software, hardware, healthcare IT vendors, EHR vendors, whoever it would be, to easily connect and get connected to the healthcare ecosystem. But the other one was the markets we chose to go after. While meaningful use drove a lot of vendors, that are solving the interoperability problem towards the acute, the health systems, eligible provider community, the ambulatory community, we went the other direction. It was a tough road to hoe for sure, but we went the other direction and said, we're going to look at all the providers around the health system that aren't necessarily incented by meaningful use dollars, but in the future will become critically important to care. And they will need to communicate. They will need the ability to exchange patient information in a seamless way. So we targeted post-acute, we targeted behavioral, we targeted vision, dental, emergency medical services, community services, which was just barely a word at the time or a phrase. And we went after those communities. In particular, we went after the EHR vendors in those communities, or if they provided some sort of electronic health record, maybe it was even an EMR, into those communities, and said, we know you may not be worried about what interoperability is impacting your communities today, but you will be, and we're going to make it easy for you to connect. So between those two kind of targeted mission statements is that we were going to get connected to all the major networks, but also provide a solution to the markets that were underserved. In our definition, has led us to where we are today as the largest aggregator of healthcare networks. And we roughly connect over 2.5 million providers. And our definition of provider, as you've already learned, is not necessarily one that has an MPI. It certainly includes that, but it extends far beyond that, because we see healthcare moving into things like schools. We see it moving, obviously social determinants of health is a huge focus. We've been focused there for a long time. In particular, how do we create interoperability? So we're proud of where we stand today. Connectivity will never leave our core mission statement, but excited about the continued future. So love what we're doing. And again, very passionate, wake up every day with the same burning desire to solve these problems as I did in day one.
Sure. And I certainly hear that from you and know that from interacting with Know2 quite a bit. And I want to call this out a little bit more, but can you put into words what drives you or Know2? What's your why for being involved in interoperability?
Absolutely. So we're all about disruption. And of course, that's maybe a buzz phrase, but I can demonstrate that and prove it by how the company operates. What drives us is getting to the root of the problem. We are now billions of dollars in. It's not just when meaningful use started. We've been working on interoperability, starting with HL7 V2 exchange for a long time. And, by argument, we've certainly made progress, but we should be a lot further along than we are. So what wakes me up every day is solving that problem. And we believe a foundational piece of that is actually connectivity, which is why we actually rebranded as a company. We don't believe we actually do interoperability as a company. We enable interoperability in the people that are engaging with the end user. We are driving connectivity. We actually call ourselves a utility, as unsexy as that may feel to some people, that's exactly what we discuss internally, is how do we become the best utility for EHR vendors, for health IT vendors, the groups that need to get connected because they're actually needing interoperability, get connected easily, start sharing information, but not have to worry about that part of it. So for us, that's exactly what wakes us up every day, is how do we enable interoperability at scale? That's a phrase that you'll see from us in our partners. Not for us to do interoperability, that's the goal of our partners, for us to drive it. When I always say, when interoperability moves from a noun to a verb, I probably say that at a point of nauseam for some people internally and maybe externally. When it goes from a noun to a verb, then we know that we're making progress in the industry. When it's not talked about as a thing and it's something that we do and software does or hardware does, then we're really making progress in the industry.
Mm-hmm. And I think you're putting this sentiment into words for many people in the industry, right? I think many of us have had this thought somewhere along the journey of, why aren't we further along? There's been so many time, material, financial investments in interoperability and trying to figure out where we're going and what's next, and what's working and what's not working. So I'm interested, you mentioned disruption. Can you tell me a little bit more about that, and what your perspective is on disruption? Because I have an idea that it's going to be pretty interesting, especially with the thoughts you just laid out about progress and interoperability. So tell us more about disruption and your perspective there.
Right. And so disruption absolutely is it's a passion of the organization, is how do we disrupt the status quo? And the status quo for us is that there is interoperability being done. And in some cases, it's very elegant, but it's not broad. It's not, wide scale in the industry. And we always have to step back and say why. And so we look at that, and disruption to the organization is really on three pillars. One is technology, of course. So we look at the industry, instead of trying to accomplish interoperability at its fullest measure, is how do we drive connectivity, the connectivity part of the equation for interoperability. One, so that's one. Two is the economics. How do we make sure that we're serving, just like the core mission of the company when we started the company, serve everybody in healthcare? We always say, from the physical therapist that sits in the strip mall that works part-time, to the social worker that's working part-time, to the health system and the largest, payer community, our model needs to fit all of those. And that's a very difficult equation for most, especially vendors, to approach. And we believe we've solved that. And we know we've solved it because we're starting to see adoption across the entire healthcare ecosystem of connectivity. So the second one being connectivity. And then the third one is actually distribution. So how do you get to market and you get everywhere, and make sure you're communicating this everywhere? So absolutely, disruption's at the core. We also don't find ourselves getting caught up in what I'd say the latest craze, right? So healthcare is notorious for that. And it's funny for me to say that because I'm kind of contradicting myself. As a company, we're banking on the confusion in the industry, but we're trying to bring sanity to that, right? But the next latest and greatest thing is going to solve the problem, and we're going to see this solved, through the latest standard or the latest initiative. Maybe. We haven't seen that yet come true with any initiative in particular. And so I always say, wait a second, folks, let's stop and see, let's take stock of what we have and make it better. We're always letting perfection get in the way of progress, which continues to create chaos in the industry. So we also see that as a point of disruption, is if we can calm the noise, and people don't care how they communicate. They just want it to happen. Like, I don't care how my mobile phone works and what network I'm using and where it's going, what, wireless protocol it's using. Don't care. Just make sure I have it and it sticks and it stays and I can communicate. That's how we see connectivity, is make it easy, make it affordable, and make it everywhere. And we'll start to see disruption in the communication of health information.
Mm-hmm. And I think Know2 has a really unique perspective because you all are involved in so many of the different interoperability communities. So you mentioned you're an aggregator. Know2 is actively involved in Direct Trust and a member of Direct Trust. I know you're also involved in the Commonwealth and Care Equality communities too. So maybe could you talk a little bit about that and what your perspective is there, and how maybe that unique perspective of being involved in those three communities, for example, might give you insight into the future or what's next.
Absolutely. So I'll go back to that kind of that disruption theme first, especially sitting in those communities, because I think we see both sides of the equation. And I'll, specifically refer to direct trust and what we see there, and I think direct trust would be the first to say meaningful use drove a lot of the activity early on in direct messaging, but it performed in terms of what was accomplished through direct trust and a framework, the nationwide framework, and I always say the train tracks that were put in place. That cannot be overlooked, because that was a very difficult, albeit imperfect, a very difficult factor that came forward, and we can't overlook that and just step away and try to do it again somewhere else. So we have to look at it and say, what can we do with that framework to improve it? And the only way we improve it is by usage outside of just referrals, for instance, or transitions of care. I think that's a critically important, by the way. But how do we improve it? And that's getting it into the hands of the end users, making sure that they understand that they have a significant opportunity. But what the industry does is that we move from, hey, how do I look at semantic interoperability? Again, critically important. But meanwhile, we have 70% of our transactions still showing up on a paper fax tray. So it's somewhere in the middle, we've got something missing, and it's back to the theme of we've got progress or perfection getting in the way of progress. Just a simple example is, what can we do with the direct trust framework to move it off the fax machine? Nobody can argue with me and say that it's not better that it shows up somewhere else because it's embedded in somebody's workflow. Well, okay, let's use it. Let's see how we can progress it. And the only way we progress it is by using it. So it's this cyclical, activity. So that's one example. Care quality, same thing. I think that it has demonstrated a lot of value in document query, and there's tremendous growth there. We've obviously incorporated FHIR and a huge opportunity with FHIR-based transaction. But let's not make sure that one supersedes the other, because we have so much value with document query, especially as it relates to system communication and the complete patient record being exchanged. And it's really the combination of all the technologies that bring true value. So what I think the future holds is the maximization of these frameworks, and then start incorporating new protocols and new standards back into the framework, but let's not walk away from them. Because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for the healthcare community at large. Again, we base our business on confusion, but if I put my hat on for the industry, let's not walk away from them. We've spent too much money, we've spent too much time, we've learned too much, and let's progress what we have.
Mm-hmm. And in a separate conversation, Jit and I were actually joking about, when will interoperability not be trending at HIMSS? It seems like, every year at HIMSS, interoperability is trending, and we know the interoperability showcase is known and loved. And I think, to your point, there's a little bit of staying power there, because we're digging in further, right? We need to see what we can do with the investments that we've made, and have some ingenuity about use cases and figuring out how things work. So I think that's really great perspective, just thinking about where we can go next. You talked about the train tracks. Where are we going next? What can we do next? And so, I'm also thinking about, from your unique perspective and being involved with these different groups, do you see any trends, or what's the next pressing opportunity for interoperability?
I might be a little bit controversial in what I say here. I hope nothing. Like, honestly, I hope nothing. I hope we, again, take stock of what we have and maximize it. If we're caught in this cycle, we need to break the cycle of the next latest and greatest thing, which there's some very active initiatives around latest and greatest thing. There always will be. But I hope nothing. And we improve what we have for the use cases, specific use cases and ever expanding use cases. Again, I'll point to the work done for ADT event notifications. I hope we maximize that for other event-based workflows, lab results that are out of range, things like that. I hope we see the maximization of that, and the work effort that the EHR vendors and the HISP have put into it start to realize value on other use cases, and it doesn't become narrow again. So that's probably controversial. And I wanted to respond to your HIMSS statement, is when interoperability is not trending at HIMSS, I think that's a great day, because that means it's something that's just occurring, and it's no longer the buzz topic. The reason it's the buzzword is because it's not solved yet. And And it's the sexy thing to do again. And how do we move forward?
And I really like what you said about hopefully nothing. Hopefully there is no new next thing, and we double down on the investments that we've made. And I'm curious, so if we want to do that, and there's something that the members of the health IT and interoperability industry need to do to further interoperability and the investments made, what's your advice to them, or what would you suggest that they do next?
Educate. It's the for a technology vendor, health IT vendor, an EHR vendor, they've put a massive amount of investment into their technology and need to be recognized for that. And I believe a huge missing link is to educate your end users on what you've done for them. Let them give you feedback on it, let them improve it. And once you educate, you'll start to see stickiness in your product. That's, I think, the key for these vendors. I believe that these standards-based initiatives have been perceived by some technology vendors as a threat to a economic model that they've built with point-to-point connections. That mindset needs to change, and look at it as an opportunity, again, to drive stickiness in your product and allow it to afford other revenue opportunities in your product. Remove the chokehold. I always say remove the chokehold on interoperability, let it flow, and other things are going to come. That's just the nature of how technology works. Other innovations are going to come into your product to drive stickiness. So educate your end users, let them know that they have direct messaging. What we have found in the industry is that people don't even know what it's called in their product, and let alone may or may not have turned it on, aren't necessarily actively using it, but could find out that, hey, instead of that document showing up on my paper fax machine, my front office staff or my medical assistants, whoever it is, can now manage it right within the HR. It's controlled, it's managed, it's an audited environment. Who wouldn't want that? It seems kind of logical, and I hate to break it down to the basics, but what a value add to your end users. And those are the areas where some innovation, a little bit of ingenuity, you start to realize opportunities for new revenue models that come back to these health IT vendors through interoperability, instead of a concern that it's a blocking event to revenue.
Sure. And, from our perspective too, from Direct Trust, we see that people are craving knowledge. We get email inquiries all the time and requests for how does this work? Or can you tell me a little bit more about Direct in this system? And so I think there's a tremendous opportunity, as you outlined. Even our Direct in Practice roundtable group, they have called for more education. And so to me, you've hit the nail on the head now that we have these investments. And, so often we were reacting and we were building the infrastructure to meet regulation, right? With meaningful use and getting it there and laying those tracks. But now we need to educate. We need to tell people that it's there. So I think that's a tremendous point, and I really hope that hits home with the listeners today. This has been a great conversation, and I am curious if you have any final thoughts, or if someone wants to find out more about Know2, what should they do?
Yeah. Final thoughts again would be educate. Let's not, I think I've kind of beat the dead horse here, but let's not continue to try to define new standards. Let's maximize what we have. And the best way to find out about Know2 is social media. So look for us on Twitter, look for us on LinkedIn. You'll see we're very active on those, and reach out to me personally. I'd love to talk to anybody, as hard it is and busy as everybody is, but love to talk. I love to talk interoperability. Often what Know2 is it's controversial, but we're good with that because we think that's what is needed in the healthcare market. So thank you also for giving us the opportunity and for the nomination. I have a lot of gratitude for that. So thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Therasa, so much for the time today. And if you want to find out more about the Interoperability Hero Initiative or learn more about Interop Hero Spotlights, go to directtrust.org/Interop Hero.